This is Joanne Geer. I'm Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project, and I'm going to introduce my co-founder and partner in crime, Michael Welling, to say a few words. Michael?
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a continuation of a series of conversations we're having around this idea of data and what is it and how to manage it and how to protect it. And I know today we'll continue many of the interesting sort of perspectives that we've seen. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, again, welcome. Myself and Joanne, co-founders of the Westchester Biotech Project, a not-for-profit organization whose mission is really to support, identify, and in many ways celebrate the work of researchers, data scientists, and engineers, really our position being they are the sort of epicenter and the common thread throughout not just the life sciences and the biotech community, but quite frankly, as you get involved in businesses of all verticals, these types of roles are starting to play a much more prominent role. We have a number of programs and initiatives currently underway. Right there, you'll see a list of some of our actual physical programs that are coming up over the next few weeks. I encourage all of you to, if you haven't already, to spend some time looking through our website, reading through some of our initiatives and roundtables, and should there be a topic or an idea that sort of is of specific interest to you, whether personally or professionally, we'd love to hear from you and figure out a way that might make sense to get you involved. This next slide here, speaking of getting involved, represents really a wonderful cross-section of our partners and supporters, representing everything from government to other associations to companies, law firms, lab companies, universities, builders, anyone who has really any interest or vested interest, should I say, in seeing this community grow, and not just for the betterment of Westchester and our surrounding region, but also just for anyone who wants to engage here and as we have started to collaborate sort of around the world. It sounds like someone's got some background noise. Yeah.
But yeah, if you're not a speaker at this moment, would you please mute yourself? I can't quite tell where that's coming from. Thank you. There you go, Michael.
All right, thank you. So anyway, so a big thank you to all of our community partners, alliance partners, participants. Everything we do is really in response to you and your interest and your questions and your ideas. So we really welcome those thoughts and ideas and appreciate all of your support. So it is, to get us kicked off today, my pleasure and my honor to introduce a longtime participant and supporter of the Westchester Biotech Project. I'll let him say a few words about himself and turn it over to Mr. Paul Savage. Paul there?
Hi, Paul.
You're muted.
You might be muted, Paul. Hi, Paul. I think you're muted. He may have had to address something. So I'll just say this picture here is Paul having a good time with his co-chair, Antonio Biancardi, at our Innovation and Research program in 2018. Let's go ahead and introduce, oh, there you are, Paul. Would you like to say a few words? It looks like you're unmuted. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and let Rebecca do her presentation, and then Paul will invite you again to say what you would like to say. Okay, I am going to make you, Rebecca, I am making you the presenter. There you go.
Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joanne, for inviting me to discuss what is truly an important topic with everyone today. Just as a little bit of my background, I've been in the IT, information security, and privacy field basically my entire adult life. And I've done such things also as teaching 7th through 12th grade math and computing between getting my bachelor's and master's degree, and have also taught 9 years at master's level classes in IT security and privacy. So I'm going to have to rein myself in here so I don't go off on a lecture and start getting deep in the weeds. So I'm really excited to talk about something that has been a concern for me for many years and something I've been talking about for quite a while. Now, I anticipate most, if not all of you on the event today are familiar with the issue of ownership of biomatter, as has been published many times with the example of Henrietta Lacks and how her cells were used for treatments and monetized for decades before her family discovered that this was going on. And we're facing similar situations with increasing frequency over the years with the ownership of personal data and how it's used and monetized by others. So, an important question for all of those who use patient data for research is how to best use that data to innovate and bring breakthrough treatments and cures resulting from the use of such things as artificial intelligence or AI, big data analytics, and more powerful computing capabilities, and a vast abundance of more health data that's available now than has ever been available before in history. And, many times more is going to be available in the coming years. So, how to use that for innovation and for benefits while also taking into account not only the considerations for the ownership of personal data, but also all of the associated privacy issues and the data security issues. So, a few questions I want you to start considering as we get started here. How is data use similar to using the actual biomatter for medical use and research? Well, for many years, researchers have been gathering and using and accumulating patient data and using it to find breakthrough treatments and cures. But what if some of the data subjects have unique characteristics within their health data that lead to medical breakthroughs? Something to consider. Did they consent to have their data used for such research to begin with? And was their data a derivative of artificial intelligence or big data analytics or some other type of downstream research work? Did their data come from some other source than directly from them? And could the same breakthroughs have been accomplished without their data? What insights into the health data patients' lives does that research reveal? And who's going to see that data? And who's using that data? And consider, could such revelations harm the data subjects in one way or another, perhaps in the way that they're published or the way that they are subsequently used? How about de-identification? Could any de-identification that perhaps was done, could that be undone? There are many privacy issues related here, and I'm going to go over a few of them in some of the coming slides, but also some things to consider as we get started. What about profits from the research using the patient data? If you could not have made the breakthrough without that patient data, is there any obligation to the associated data subjects to share the profits? The patients that the data actually represents? So I want to give you a quick example from a research publication. There was a situation, it was describing a person named Stephen Petro. And when Stephen Petro was 26 years old in 1984, he was treated for testicular cancer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. Many of his body parts, in essence, were taken from him. Well, let's fast forward to 2018 when Stephen read a news article, and he read that the cancer center that he had been to back in 1984 had decided to grant exclusive access to scans of its really vast pathology collection to a private for-profit company, presumably, he thought, including his tissue samples, which made sense to him since that's where he had the treatment done. Well, according to the cancer center, the samples were to be linked to medical records, but according to the center, the personal details were removed. Well, Stephen Petro then, in talking with the researchers, he said, quote, it really made me wonder, first of all, where are the tissue samples? And did those tissue samples that were taken from me, do they belong to me or do they belong to the hospital? Do I have any rights over them? Should I have been notified before they were sold to someone else? And the fact that it might have been commercialized or monetized, isn't that part of me that's being monetized? That's deeply upsetting to me, end quote. So, related questions to consider is, how is ownership of personal data determined, and how does ownership of personal data used to produce research results using artificial intelligence and big data analytics and other tech and algorithms related to privacy, security, and data ownership considerations? There's growing concern and growing efforts to establish clear laws and detailed regulations about this. Now, the possible medical breakthroughs for finding treatments and cures using patient data with new tech is exciting and it's full of promise. But as those breakthroughs are being pursued, researchers always need to keep in mind that the data are representations of the associated individuals. So again, I'm giving you a lot of questions to think about. What rights do patients have for the parts of their own body and associated representations in any form, even digital, that represent part of their being? When, where, and how is data being taken from or derived about individuals, and how is the data then being used about them? And then think about what harms could occur to those individuals as a result of maybe misuse or maybe even sharing or publication. How could the associated risks be mitigated and any associated compliance requirements be addressed while supporting such innovations? I have colleagues who are privacy lawyers in the European Union, and there's been a huge regulation that went into effect last May. And my friends in Europe, they advise that biomaterial is considered to be personal information there as well as personal data. Laws and bills are currently being considered in growing numbers of jurisdictions throughout the world as well as within the United States. So when we're thinking about ownership, ownership brings with it generally certain types of control, and privacy is about control, control of your own personal data and how it's used and shared and revealed and retained. Ownership and privacy are very closely related. It's generally viewed by privacy experts and advocates that establishing personal data ownership legal rights to those about whom the data applies will improve privacy by giving legal rights to those individuals for controlling how their personal data is used and shared, modified, monetized, and a wide range of other actions. And by also then providing a means for making those who violate ownership rights accountable for their actions when the personal data is owned by others. So such ownership is also viewed as a way to protect privacy for those who have experienced negative impacts from insurance companies or employers or banks and loan institutions, law enforcement, and others who may have used the personal data in ways that are negative to the lives of associated individuals. So these are some of the things that are being discussed right now, increasingly more often and throughout recent years. Now, in December of 2017, I want to give you some examples. In 2017 of December, the University of Melbourne researchers published a report with Cornell University Library, and they detailed how they re-identified data listed in an open data set of Australian medical billing records. I'm bringing this up because oftentimes during research, a lot of folks say, well, it's been de-identified, so we don't have to worry about security or privacy issues anymore. So I want to point out that, there is a need to consider security and privacy, even if it's been claimed that the data has been de-identified. So in this example, with the University of Melbourne, they found that patients could be re-identified without decrypting the encrypted data. Their data was actually encrypted, and they found that they could re-identify the associated patients through a process of linking the unencrypted parts of the record, including such things as the metadata, and with known information about the individuals, such as medical procedures and year of birth. So it really demonstrated the astonishing ease with which de-identification can fail, or demonstrate how de-identification is not something that you should depend upon as removing all responsibility for security and privacy. So showing how data sharing without fully addressing security and privacy issues can take what on the surface may seem to be anonymized or often called aggregated data, and through some really comparatively simple algorithmic processes, re-identify that data, even if it was encrypted, but that has metadata involved to provide insights to the individuals. One more quick example, a similar study was published in Scientific Reports, and a researcher, a publication called Scientific Reports, and a researcher used location data on 1.5 million people from a mobile phone data set, and it was collected over 15 months. That researcher was able to identify 95% of the people in the anonymized data set using just 4 unique data points from that data set. With just 2 unique data points, he could also identify 50% of the people in the data set. So I could keep giving many different examples for hours, but these examples stretch way back to at least 1997, when LaTanya Sweeney, who's went to Harvard and Carnegie Mellon, she conducted her first re-identification experiment, and she successfully identified then Massachusetts Governor William Weld to his medical records using only the publicly accessible records. So implementing information security without being legally compelled, I found over the years, is very rare. I've worked with hundreds of different organizations, and I found that such funds necessary and resources necessary for security and privacy are typically not viewed by business leaders as bringing a return on investment, or ROI. And so information security and privacy practitioners, they're always struggling to find ways to implement security and privacy controls and safeguards with really limited funding. So what happens? Well, this often results in security gaps. Security gaps leave holes within the digital environment that can then be exploited, and it leads to growing numbers of security incidents and privacy breaches. And this is especially true in the medical industry. Now, add to this the fact that few organizations have full clarity of knowledge for where all of their data is located and who's accessing it. And of course, this lack of insight creates even more security holes. And so you end up having even more incidents and breaches. This can happen with all the patient data used for research as well in these similar types of circumstances. And just, even if it is encrypted or de-identified, as I just explained on the previous slide, layers of security are necessary for effective security. And related to this lack of insight to where data is located, think about where all that data that researchers collect and process and store, transmit, share, handle, and so on is located. It's very, very rare to have someone know and actually have documented exactly all of the devices and the types of files where patient data is found. And when you start thinking about where all of this data ends up being stored, whether on purpose or just as a result of using tech, you have browsers and hard drive cache and memory in a wide range of devices and health trackers, smartphones. Oh, the list could go on. I mean, even in email and the associated metadata and spreadsheets and so many different places. One mid-sized hospital that called me a few years ago, they had around 8 to 10 clinics in just one hospital facility. So by any measure, they were a fairly small hospital facility. I came in, I helped them to figure out where data might be leaking from. We discovered that they had over 50,000 devices that were being used and attached sometimes all the time to their network. And they needed to have some level of security on those devices and where that data was found. Now, they had all the data storage capabilities within those devices too. So anyone who would have gotten into their networks could have found the data if they were actually looking for that type of data. So here's another real life example. So a security research friend of mine purchased a pacemaker on eBay. When he got it, he found that it had patient data of multiple patients still stored on it. And it had all of the accompanying health data and physician notes and lab data and so on stored within it in clear text. Here's another example. In a conference session, a researcher described finding 300 medical devices from 40 different vendors who had actually hard-coded passwords within those medical devices. That's bad. Now, why is that bad? Well, hard-coded passwords are basically known passwords. If you hard code passwords, they are going to be documented somewhere, and it's probably online. If I went onto eBay or Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, anywhere else really, if I wanted to find health research data, I'm pretty confident that I would be able to, and I would bet that that data would be in clear text. Now, this is an infographic I created just 2 or 3 years ago, and I created this, and I realize it's kind of hard to see. I think you'll be able to, if you download the presentation, you'll be able to zoom in. But I created this a few years ago to demonstrate how easily and quickly health data can be collected and stored and shared and processed throughout the vast tech environment that exists within healthcare organizations. Now, where does all of that patient data go? Well, it's often unknown because of the many ways that data is transmitted. And oftentimes through these devices, that transmission is happening automatically, or the pathway is created there so that anyone on the network can actually be able to get access to the device. And apps are especially leaky. A wide variety of research studies have shown that anywhere from 70 to 90%, depending on the research study you look at, 70-90% of apps used with the connected devices lack key security controls. I mean, basic things such as authentication and encryption. Most people assume that the devices and associated apps that they use come secured, but in reality, the large majority of them have significant security and privacy problems. So the numbers of laws and regulations are also increasing. So that's something else that you need to think about besides the real risk related to security and privacy. In the US and throughout the world, legal protections are increasing. There are more expanded laws and regulations, with many that are including very specific requirements. And there's more being proposed than ever before. Health and patient data is of particular concern because it has some of the highest values in not only the dark web, but also by organizations that want to be able to get and use such data. And in addition to these laws and regulations, there's also more contractual requirements of a wide variety that are being established. So here's an example. A research study published last September, it focused on genomic data sharing throughout 7 different countries, and this included in the United States. And it found security practices for health data sharing varied greatly throughout all of the other countries. It ultimately determined that the increased use of big data and artificial intelligence and the wide range of legal requirements throughout the countries, it found that research using genomic and other health data needs to follow universally harmonized data protections to support more innovation through more secure data sharing. Now, I want to just really briefly mention HIPAA in particular, since that's a regulation that most organizations point to for protecting health data, or the health data that is defined as protected health information under HIPAA. Now, the privacy rule protects all individually identifiable health information that's held or transmitted in any form, and it covers using patient data for research. But through my work with numerous healthcare providers, the key HIPAA requirement, which is obtaining consent for using patient data for research, is usually all that's done, at least by the healthcare providers that I've worked with and spoken to during my research. That's usually the only thing that's done when ever sharing that data for research. So what happens to that data when it's shared with others for research? Even if it is considered to be de-identified, it typically is not restricted from being combined with other data sets after it has been shared to other, and it's not restricted. And the use of the provider's de-identified data is typically not tracked. So when you think about all of the artificial intelligence and big data capabilities, think about how it increases the risk then that it will be re-identified, and the providers will often not even realize that the data that they gave for research has been re-identified until maybe a published report is made about a related privacy breach. Or I know there's several who have learned after they received a notice of a lawsuit that was filed against them. So many direct to consumer services and products that involve personal data and increasing amounts of health data are largely unregulated. So I listed a lot of the increasing regulations. Those are often in the healthcare and other very highly regulated industries. But think about all of the different devices that are not in industries that are regulated. You know, the direct to consumer testing businesses and IoT vendors are largely not regulated. I've gotten dozens of questions, in fact, from various such vendors who provide direct to consumers IoT devices and apps and services that involve collecting and processing and sharing health data. And what's interesting to me is that many of them contact me primarily to ask how they can avoid being required to comply with HIPAA security and privacy requirements. This typically translates to not putting any meaningful security and privacy controls at all within their devices, apps, or services, except for a typical default password that never gets changed or that is hard coded or that can be found documented online. Now, new regulations and laws will disrupt these practices because lawmakers know that this is a tactic that's going on. For example, there was a new law passed in Brazil last September, and it goes into effect in 2020, and it's going to cover such personal data, and also it's going to establish a very wide range of very specific protections and practices for all types of devices and services throughout all types of industries. Now, in 2016, one of our hosts, Joanne Gear, who introduced everything, well, Joanne hosted another fabulous event that she actually mentioned when at the beginning of the event we're doing right now. And this was one of the panels that I facilitated. It was a panel of regulators and standards representatives, and we discussed security and privacy requirements for medical devices and associated data. Now, if you're interested in seeing it, it's a 1 hour, 19-minute video, and it's available at the link shown. I think it's important to point out that the laws and regulations have been changed or are considered to be changed from what is mentioned in the video. But I thought you might be interested in watching to hear some of the discussions from back then from the regulators about some of the security and privacy risks. Now, since this time, though, what's very interesting is what the FDA representative had told us back then, because the FDA has since then created some new guidance and rules, and you can find those on the FDA's website. So, you know, here are what are typically considered as being all the different types of privacy. And I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but I did want to point out that there are more than just one type of privacy considerations that that you need to consider when you're dealing with all of this personal data that you're receiving. So privacy of the person is really focused on the person's physical being and the representation of the body, and it's directly applicable to patient data and research. You have privacy of behavior and actions. It's focused on personal activities. Privacy and thoughts and feelings focused on the protection of individuals to ensure that their thoughts and feelings are not shared inappropriately with others. You have communications privacy, and you also have information privacy, territorial privacy, privacy association. Now, this addresses the groups that individuals associate with and belong to and not monitoring for their group membership or activities. But this category also addresses the types of groups that individuals belong to or for which they have no control. For example, DNA testing can show that an individual is predisposed to certain types of diseases, And gathering and revealing this information may result in the individual being excluded from attending schools or other types of institutions or employers using the results of the testing to make these different types of decisions. There are also many types of privacy harms that could occur to the associated individuals. There have already been instances in the US when children were prohibited from attending private preschools because of their DNA showing such things as they were potentially, not actually, but potentially going to be allergic to peanuts. Well, the private school did not want to deal with a special diet, so they did not allow the children into their school. If schools got access to the data, they could use it to prohibit a student from attending a school or participating in other types of programs. Another real life example, a student in California was healthy, but the school found out through a quote fun DNA analysis, end quote, that the student had a genetic disposition for cystic fibrosis. And so that student was kicked out of the school. So the privacy over that type of information was something that had different types of effects on that individual. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the descriptions of these, but certainly it's something to cover at some point, which is important to understand what those different harms could be. So when it comes to using health data and other types of personal data for analysis, research, or other uses, privacy and security risks need to be considered and addressed through the entire life cycle of the data, including when big data analysis and artificial intelligence and de-identification or anonymized data is being used. Now, you must secure as much as feasible and in accordance with compliance requirements, but also be aware that more security and privacy risks exist that should be addressed that are beyond the established legal requirements. Organizations always need to address additional security and privacy issues beyond the explicitly stated compliance requirements because there's always new security and privacy risks emerging all the time. And it's really necessary to address these controls and implement them to protect your patients and your research subjects and your business, not just to meet compliance. And those risks and requirements are not static. They're going to increase as new tech emerges and is adopted. So that is a very quick overview of many different things. Here's my contact information if you ever have questions or need help. Feel free to get in touch. Thank you for listening. And now let's open up our panel discussion.
Hi, this is Joanne Gear again. Oh my gosh, my hair is curled every time I hear you present, and I can see that the people on the call have been, giving you rapt attention. First, I want to check in with Paul Savage. Paul, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, good morning, or good afternoon at this point. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes, we can. That's great.
Oh,
Thanks.
terrific. My apologies for the touch buttons that we have to go through. But I wanted to thank everyone for participating this afternoon as co-chairman of the Translation of Data Science. It is an honor to be with you. And just as introduction, I own a company called Healthcare Intelligence. I've been working with large data sets in the healthcare field for many, many years, as well as an academic for New York Medical College, Hofstra University, and Iona College. So, Rebecca, I wanted to thank you so much for this incredible presentation. Having worked with this data for so many years, and certainly being familiar with HIPAA, we've only begun to scratch the surface. And as you've ably described, there are so many sources of data that we need to become much more concerned and alert to. So again, I just wanted to thank everyone's participation today. And back to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Paul. So what we'll do now is I'm going to introduce our first discussant, and she's going to chat for a little bit, and then we're going to go around and invite everyone one by one on the call to share your thoughts, introduce yourself, any questions about the talk we've just done. I will mention that we are recording, and we'll put on our YouTube channel everything up through Angela Radcliffe's introduction, and then after that, if we want to quote you in any way, we'll come back and ask for your permission. But these are often really great conversations, so we do appreciate having a recording. Let's see. So if you're not going to be speaking right now, please do mute yourself. And I'd like to introduce Angela Radcliffe.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're hailing from. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Absolutely a wealth of topics that we could talk about. I almost don't know where to start. I head up the R&D practice for Capgemini and Vent, and what that means in real terms is that my job is to help everyone from small biotechs to Fortune 500 companies to pharma companies conduct clinical trials through the lens of digital transformation and change, which is, as you can imagine, exponential in the clinical trials R&D space right now. And of course, a real hot topic for us right now in this space is privacy. I also happen to sit on the advisory board for a company called Humanity.co, and Humanity.co has raised a very interesting question in relationship to this topic that Rebecca actually touched on, and even I noticed a screenshot from a very excellent NPR interview that happened on the topic of data property versus data privacy. And I think there's a couple things I just want to throw out there for additional fodder for discussion on top of what Rebecca shared. One is property and privacy are not mutually exclusive. Even if we get to a point where we all own our data, the way that we own title to our house or our car, and we own all aspects of our data, and we have the ability enforced by governments and regulations, et cetera, to do with our data what we please, lease it, share it, donate it, give it, et cetera. That doesn't take away the need for us to continue to consider privacy, in addition to considering the impact of sharing our data with not just the humans that use our data now, but the machines. And so, you know, it's really interesting to consider that there could be great backlash, and this is really a provocative topic in the R&D space, that we already have a difficult enough time enrolling patients in clinical trials because of existing stigmas. And now when we start to dig into how that consent is happening and how our data is truly being utilized, as well as the fact that there are now AI and machine learning and algorithm bias on top of that potentially that we have to be concerned about, this becomes something very important for us to continue to discuss. Should we own our data, and what would that mean for society, and what does that mean for privacy, and how our privacy regulations would need to change as well. On the more positive side of things, the potential for creating a fully consented, clean, interoperable longitudinal record for each of us as humans and patients, that promise and that promise's impact on our ability to bring cures to market faster is really, really important for us to think about. And I think right now we are in a position where at the sort of Goldilocks conditions of change, as you will, for data property. And that is that property ownership of our data could potentially be good for the human, and for corporations, and for society and governments. And so it's very rare in time that we have those conditions present where you could see a shared good for all stakeholders in something like this. The final thing that I'll throw out as additional sort of fodder for discussion is back to the topic of de-identification. I spent a year working in a programmatic health technology company, and what fascinated me was, you know, we've all been exposed to the ads that quote unquote follow us around the internet. You know, we weren't even searching for something, and magically it seems to have read our mind and an advertisement appears. And in recent months, it's really become apparent now that de-identification is truly a myth. And I think people don't realize that we have the technology now that even if we aren't identified as a person, we are identified as a cookie on the internet through things like cross-device technology that helps companies see that we are a cookie on our computer, and we're a cookie on our cell phone, and we're a cookie on the GPS in our car. These dots can now be connected. And so again, just it's ever more important now, if we're going to protect the promise of what this data can do in healthcare, an area we're all deeply passionate about, that we continue to have these tough conversations around privacy and property for our data. So